Welcome to Jobber's Gospel Thoughts and more Old Testament. And today we continue with the story of David. David Part 2, David the Fugitive. So the story of David, the beloved, ended with expressions of love between him and Jonathan and a covenant in chapter 20, verse 42. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever." And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So Jonathan facilitates David's escape, and this covenant that they just made before they depart is really important after the death of Jonathan, because that's how some of the posterity of Saul, male posterity of Saul, gets preserved. Chapter 21 is the start of David's official fugitive period. And he needs sustenance, and he needs weapons, and he needs to find some refuge. So he goes to Gath. He goes to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech means my brother is king. He goes to the priest, and the priest is Ahimelech the priest is surprised to see David there. "What are you doing here, David?" And David conjures up a story about a mission that he has from the king. Ahimelech doesn't suspect anything, because they know that David is a champion in Israel, and so there is nothing strange about the story. And David is hungry, so he asks for some bread. And Ahimelech doesn't have anything. Now, it has to be understood that Ahimelech isn't lying or anything about this, but the priests lived through the sacrifice system. When people brought sacrifices, the priests and the Levites would eat off of it, and they would eat the bread and things that people brought in. They had a share in that, what wasn't sacrificed. So at that point in the day, he came in when there were no sacrifices, or when the meat was all eaten. And so all he had was shewbread. And the shewbread, those of you who remember the description of the tabernacle, remember that in the Holy of Holies there is a table with shewbread on it, and that is holy bread. It's a sign of the covenant between God and Israel, and only the priests, the Levites, are allowed to eat from it. So, and of course you have to be in a state of purity to eat of it. And Ahimelech says, "Are your men, are you in a state of purity?" And David assures him of that, and he eats the bread. Now, this is in the New Testament. This is a story that the Savior refers to, and about eating shewbread, but that's another story for another time. David needs weapons, so in verse 9, the priest gives him the sword of Goliath. The sword is taken as a booty from war. It doesn't belong to David, and so David takes it, and he compliments its manufacture and workmanship, and he basically flees. After he does that, he flees to this other city called Gath. Now, in Gath, in chapter 22, verse 2, "And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, unto David, and he became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. 400 men with David. It's the army of the marginalized in Israel, the people who were in debt, people who were not happy with Saul's reign, and they become his little private army. Now, when we talk and think about King David or Saul or the Philistines or any of these battles that we read about here, you're thinking small scale tribal warfare, just a few hundred men fighting each other for control of territory, or for spoils of war, basically. So, but David has this group of 400, and then he goes to Moab. Now remember, David is a descendant of Ruth the Moabite. So they are family. And so he goes and takes refuge there. And Moab is his ancestral home. And then and the prophet Gad in verse 5, chapter 22, and the prophet Gad said unto David, abide not in the hold. So that's in Moab. Depart and get thee into the land of Judah. So he sends him back to Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hareth. Now, the name Hareth is interested. It can mean to till the land for planting in it, but it also can mean protection. So that's what he is. And when Saul, in verse 6, and when Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. So Saul is just on alert. He knows that there is potential here for a mutiny against him. So he is on the ready. And he moves and goes after David. Now, when he inquires about the whereabouts of David, there is this man, Dog the Edomite, and Dog the Edomite tells them, because he was present with Ahimelech the priest when David showed up, so he tells him that Ahimelech the priest assisted David and tells him what happened. So Saul orders an unsuspected Ahimelech to come before him, which Ahimelech does and tries to defend his actions by saying in verse 14, then Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? So this is perfectly legitimate defense, but Saul at this point has lost his mind, and he just slays all the priests that came with Ahimelech. So Saul is just going from one bad situation to a worse situation, and there is no turning back. And now he's killing holy men. But one of the priests in verse 20, son of Ahimelech, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David, and tells David what happened. And David says, abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt be in safeguard. So that is chapter 22. Now, chapter 23 is a new stage in David's fugitive cycle. Now, as I said earlier, these things go, the stories of the Old Testament, many of them, when you're talking about a major figure like David, there is this David cycle, it's called, or the Abraham cycle, or the Jacob cycle. It just phases in their life. And this is the fugitive state. And it will make sense reading these stories about David's fugitive period would make a lot of sense about many of the Psalms that we will read later on, we'll study later on, because he talks about his enemies chasing him, he wishes them destruction, and so it will make sense understanding the fugitive state. So in chapter 23, David smites the Philistines. So this is David establishing his cred. He's a fugitive, but he's still defending Israel, and he goes after the Philistines who have invaded Keilah, and he fights them there and smites them and wins against them and establishes credits as a defender of Israel. But in verse 7, Saul is told about what David did in Keilah, and he misinterprets David's intentions. So he takes the army and goes to Keilah to defeat David. And so at this point we have Jonathan showing up again in verse 16. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God. So always the good friend, always giving him assurances. Jonathan goes there. Jonathan is always in the story. He's always strengthening and cheering David up. And in verse 19, even though David has helped them, the Ziphites go to Saul in Gibeah and they offer to help him in getting David, because Saul is the king and their loyalty is to him, and it seems they kind of still like him, and they offer to help with capturing David. So moving on to chapter 24. So now the setup in the end of chapter 23, David is on one side of the mountain, Saul is on one side of the mountain, getting ready to fight. Chapter 24 is when the theme of a robe shows up again. And that's very important. We talked about Saul ripping the robe of Samuel, Samuel getting upset about that, then Jonathan giving his robe to David, which is a sign, at least the way the writer intended it, of the kingship moving over to David, or being bestowed on David, establishing his credits as the king. And now David finds Saul asleep in a cave and spares his life in chapter 24. And the way David does it is he sneaks up on Saul and takes a piece of his robe. Now this serves two purposes. On one hand, remember what I said earlier about tearing robes, and that means you've taken authority out of someone. So David takes a piece of Saul's robe and doesn't do anything to him. And he wanted to show Saul, on one hand, that he's not going to kill him, that he doesn't mean him ill, but he also shows him, tells him in a very indirect way that you're no longer king. I do not respect you. In verse 17 of chapter 24, verse 14 actually, when Saul and David have this confrontation, David is very humble. This is one thing about him when it comes to Saul. He's very humble, very tender with Saul, and he genuinely doesn't intend to kill him. It shows you his loyalty, and it's always a bad thing for a king to start his rule, especially in the ancient times. You start your rule by assassinating your predecessor or killing your predecessor, because that established a precedent. So it's also a kind of self-preservation here. But he says to Saul in verse 14, chapter 24, "After whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea?" Now, David on one hand knows he's not that, but he's also humbling himself before Saul, and he assures him that he doesn't mean him harm. And then verse 16 starts a sad encounter. "And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept." So this is where you feel sad for Saul. This is where it's a very sad encounter. A fallen man who's having these emotions, and he calls him my son. And sometimes when I read this story, I think maybe that was a trick to get David to drop his guard and come in and all hugs and kisses and nothing is wrong, and then Saul captures him, which is a trick in even the modern Middle East. When one of the incidents in the 50s, the king of Jordan calls an election. Everyone runs for election, free, democratic, and then the elections happen. Everyone is feeling secure, and then he orders a secret police, and they go and round up everyone and throws them in jail, and that's how he gets rid of his political enemies. So David is not going to fall for that. And he said to David, "Thou art more righteous than I." In verse 18, "And thou hast showed this day how thou hast dealt well with me." And then in verse 19, he says, "This is unusual behavior. When you find your enemy, you kill him." And verse 21 is an oath. "Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house." So that's very important. Saul doesn't want his father's name, his name, to die out. And again, Jonathan made a covenant with David about the same thing. Saul made a covenant in the family of Saul. That's very important. Preserving their legacy, preserving. In my second podcast, I talked about in the ancient Near East, people wanted to have that perpetuity. They wanted perpetuity, and in ancient Israel, they did that through having children, having male children, as many of them as you can, so your name is not cut out. Your generations are not cut out. Verse 22, "And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men gat them up unto the hold." So they went back to safety. They did not fall for that, but there was this covenant, and David will honor that covenant. He will honor it. He's honest about it. And even, as we will see later, even when Saul's grandson, the one that David was good to, betrays David, David does not harm him. So he does not harm him, even though maybe indirectly he will. I mean, another story when we talk about Solomon. So now we're in chapter 23. They are hiding, and then verses 27 and 29 in chapter 23. There is chapter 23, verses 27 through 29. Yes, Saul is so distracted by David that the Philistines invade, and he has to go to Engadi to save parts of Israel. So, chapter 24. Again, I got mixed up here. So we're in chapter 25 now. Samuel dies. And so Samuel the prophet dies, the last ally of Saul, sort of. And there is this character, his name is Nabal. And the only reason Nabal, which his name means foolish, shows up in the story is because his wife will be important in the story. Genealogy is really important to ancient Israelites. And so Nabal, he's a Benjaminite. David asks for his help. David is actually protecting the cattle of Nabal with his men. David's men are protecting Nabal's cattle. And David, of course, asks for bread. He asks for food for his people. And Nabal refuses to give him assistance and insults him on top. And so David decides to go down and destroy Nabal and his family. And there is, starting in verse 13, he asks his men to gird their loins, gird their swords, and he goes down and to kill Nabal's family. But Abigail intercedes here. Abigail, Nabal's wife, in verse 18, Abigail goes down, and Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine and 5 sheep ready dressed. She takes all of this food down and feeds David's men. And then there is this beautiful poetry. Of course, in English you don't get a lot of it, but she pleads with David to spare Nabal and spare her family and her land. And she says Nabal is a foolish, like his name implies. And David praises her wisdom. And David says unto Abigail in verse 32, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me, and blessed be thy advice, and blessed be thou, which has kept me this day from coming to shed blood, and from avenging myself with mine own hands." Now, insulting an important leader like David, ancient and modern Near East, is not a good idea. So Abigail saved the day. And after 10 days after, in verse 38, 10 days after this event, Nabal dies. The Lord smote Nabal and he died. And when David heard Nabal was dead, he said, Blessed be the Lord that hath pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and hath kept his servant from evil, for the Lord hath returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head. And David sent and communed with Abigail to take her to him to wife. So David, this is not just a marriage for the sake of intimacy or because he just loved Nabal, loved Abigail. This is a marriage, also an alliance. It's a form of alliance. Nabal was a rich man. Obviously, Abigail had a lot of say on how the fortune, how the cattle were taken care of. So David is forging an alliance here, and Abigail becomes his wife. So chapter 26, again, uh, David and Saul's last encounter. David and Saul meet again, and the Ziphites came to Saul, and they offer to get David again. They to help Saul take David again, and they take Saul again to where David is. And again, David spares Saul's life. And this time he takes his sword and keeps it. Now, the Ziphites always make me think of distractions. We all have the Ziphites in our life. Israel gets invaded when Saul is going after David, and they are always the ones encouraging Saul to come after David. They probably didn't want this gang of 400 men roaming the mountains, running away, bringing people, and so they would go and try to use Saul to get rid of David. So they are a distraction, and every time they distract, the enemies of Israel attack it, and they win. So we have this final encounter, and Saul knew David's voice. In verse 17, chapter 26, and Saul knew David's voice and said, Is this thy voice, my son David? Again, very touching, and David said, It is my voice, my Lord, O King. Again, asserting his loyalty. Now, therefore, I pray thee, my Lord, the king, hear the words of his servant. And he goes into this, again, beautiful rhetoric. And in verse 21, then said Saul, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day. Behold, I have played the fool, and have erred exceedingly. Saul, you see a little bit of the old Saul, the humble Saul. He admits his mistake. Again, you think maybe not, but this sounds sincere enough. 25, verse 25 of chapter 26, then Saul said to David, Blessed be thou, my son David, thou shalt both do great things, and also shalt still prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. So again, David doesn't completely trust Saul, and he decides to stay in safety. And then in chapter 27, David moves to Achish, at Gath, and lives amongst the Philistines. And he pretends that he's a Philistine ally. Now, some of you might think this is strange that David would go to the enemies of Israel. It is not really strange, and at least to the Philistines, tribal alliances change. The friend of today is tomorrow's enemy. It's very common in those tribal cultures. I wouldn't say it's common today, but it's that you still find shadows of it in Middle Eastern politics. Enemies and friends change all the time. Your enemy today is your friend tomorrow, and vice versa. And David uses this. He pretends in verses 8 through 10 of chapter 27, he pretends that he's attacking Israel and getting all these spoils from Israel, but he's not. He is actually attacking Philistine villages. He's attacking Philistine villages, But when he's asked, he tells them that when the Philistines ask about where he's bringing the spoils from, he says he's attacking the Kenites and Judah. So he's attacking his own people. Now, the Philistines decide to go to war against Saul, and but that's not here. Chapter 28, there is this war going on, and Saul decides to do something that Israelites were forbidden from doing. It's one of the mitzvahs, one of the commandments. Do not deal with people who deal with spirits and witchcraft and who talk to spirits and all of that. So Saul goes to the witch of Endor for revelation. And again, we have the theme of the robe, because the witch knows about the prohibition against witchcraft and against bringing dead souls from the spirit world, but she doesn't know Saul, the king, is before her. That's why he goes disguised to her, and she brings up the spirit, and of course it's the spirit of Samuel. In verse 14, notice chapter 28 verse 14, and he said unto her, what form is he? And she said, an old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. Again, this robe here, the mantle. And of course Saul knows this mantle because he ripped it. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. And of course Samuel does not mince words. He basically tells Saul that he sinned, he did something he shouldn't do, and he and his children will die. Sounds severe, but that's what Samuel says. Now that's what Samuel says to Saul. And of course Saul is very sad, refuses to eat, but the witch doesn't want the king to die at her doorstep, so she feeds him and she lets him go. Now chapter 29, Israel and the Philistines gather for war. David offers assistance, and judging by his previous behavior, attacking Philistine villages and pretending the spoils were from Judah, and how can he hide that? In the past, you'd think maybe they discovered him. Well, when those attacks happen, it's easy to disguise yourself, pretend you're someone else. And because David's gang was an Israelite, probably they thought it was the Israelites attacking them. They didn't know it was David. So now there is this war brewing, and David offers his assistance, maybe to act as a fifth column to help the Israelite army. But the Philistine leaders, the tribal leaders, are aware or can sense something, and they do something. They say, no, we're not bringing you with us. And David, in verse 8, chapter 29, and David said unto Achish, but what have I done? And what hast thou found in thy servant, so long as I have been with thee unto this day, that I may not go fight against the enemies of my lord the king? And Achish answered and said to David, I know thou art good in my sight as an angel of God. Notwithstanding, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. So the princes of the Philistines are suspicious, but Achish is probably, that's why David attached himself to Achish, because Achish is probably easily beguiled, easily tricked. So we don't know. Maybe that's the reason. Wherefore, but Achish goes further, and he just casts him out of the land. He says, go rise up early in the morning with thy master's servants that are come with thee, and as soon as ye be up early in the morning and have light, depart. So he wants him to depart early. No one sees him, so that no one would kill him, because he no longer has the protection of the king. Of course, the enemy of Israel, the Amalekites, remember I said earlier, actually it's a mitzvah to always, it's a positive and negative mitzvah. One is to kill Amalekites, and one to always remember what the Amalekites did to the people of Israel when they entered the Holy Land. So when it comes to Amalekites, Israelites basically don't want to spare any of them. It's a commandment. It's a commandment. That's all I'm going to say about this. But the Amalekites spoil Ziklag at the coast of Judah, and they take away David's wives, and they take 600 people. But David chases after them. He finds an Egyptian on the way, an Egyptian servant, and the Egyptian helps him and to find the Amalekite camp. And David harms them. He basically kills all of them and retakes what his. And then David takes the spoils. So this is usual now. David senses, he knows the Philistines are going after Saul. There's going to be this big war. He knows the status of Saul's army. He's not there to help. So he starts building his own loyalties. So he sends the spoils from Ziklag. Must have been lots of spoils because he sends it to several cities. What interesting about the names of the cities that he sends the spoils to? First, he sends it to Bethel. Remember, this is a holy place. This is a place associated with the covenants with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He sends it to Ramoth. He sends it to Judah. He sends it to Jatir. These are Levite cities. So he wants the loyalty of the priest, the Levitical, the priestly class in Israel. And then he sends it to all of these cities that protected him. He sends them to cities from their names like Arior, which means to accumulate. Sifmoth, which is a city which its name means fence keepers. So maybe it's one of those strong cities. He's sending it to strategic cities, the spoils, paying them to show that he is worthy to be king of Israel. He senses it. And then in chapter 31, which is the final chapter of 1 Samuel, Saul dies, his sons die, the Philistines win, and then verses 11 and 12 and 13, the bodies of Saul and his children are burnt, and their bones are buried under a tree. In ancient Judaism, the burial ritual is you put the bodies in a cave, you wait until they decompose, and you go take the bones and you put the bones in a jar and you bury the jar. So you have to have the bones. And here, to speed up the process, they burn the bodies, get the bones, and bury the bones. So this is not the kind of burial at high temperatures. This is burial hot enough to burn the flesh but keep the bones intact. It's just the ritual. But there is something in verse 9 about Saul's head being cut off, and he's stripped of his armors and sent to the land of the Philistines round about to publish it in the house of their idols and among the people. That was the custom. So Saul is dead. David is establishing loyalties, and the road is paved for him to be King David. But there is still a process that he has to go through, and that will be in the next broadcast. Thank you for listening.